Yeah, man. So one of the big news stories that came out was that Bryce Young is not going to be throwing or doing any of the drills at the NFL Combine and instead waiting on his pro day. Man, I have a lot to say about this. I personally don't think that this is a great decision for Bryce Young. But you know what? We have a special guest tonight who's here with us to talk about all things NFL draft. He is Joe Deleone from the Believe in NFL Draft Prospects, and he is joining the C3 Panthers podcast to talk about this combine experience. Joe, how are you, brother?
I'm
Man,
doing
look,
great.
we've been practicing your name, and when we practiced it, we got off. Now I was the one fumbling and bumbling. Joe Deleone.
You got it. I mean, you guys are both
Yes,
close. I've
yes,
gotten much
yes.
worse butcherings. As long as it's
No,
DeLeon or DeLeone, you guys are
No, I
close.
was listening to the show today. I was listening to your podcast today. I was like, man, I'm going to get it right. And then we were practicing and I was fumbling and stumbling. Welcome to the C3 Panthers podcast.
Well, I will say I appreciate the amount of effort ahead of me coming on. The show that I was just on before hopping on here, one of the guys on it, and they were also live, was eating chips while he was asking me questions. I've never had anything like that happen before. So it's like a total 180 of going from that to you guys. I appreciate the warm welcome, and I'm excited to talk about the combine.
Hey, you know, we're an upstart little rinky-dink Panthers podcast, but we try and carry ourselves with the air of professionalism. But no, Joe, listen, we certainly thank you for being a part of the podcast tonight. I can't speak for my partners, but I don't have any chips near me, so I think we'll be good to go. Joe, I wanted to talk with you about this decision from Bryce Young to not throw or not do anything at the combine. And this isn't new. Andrew Luck has done this before. Sam Darnold did it. Even Joe Burrow chose to skip and wait until the pro day. But I also feel like Bryce Young, being 5'10", speculated at 185 pounds, might not have been in the best position to not want to go out there and show his abilities, especially when you have Stroud, Levis, and Richardson choosing to compete and do these things. What do you make of this? Is it a story at all? Is Bryce still a lot to go number one? Or could this actually have an effect on his draft stock come April?
Right. I understand both angles of this, but in the perspective that you're talking about, but the way that I perceive this is that we already know who Bryce Young is as a prospect. We know that he is very accurate. We know that he is a very bright mind, and we know that he has really great instincts to play the position. So for him to go out there and if he completes every ball or maybe misses one, that just reinstates the understanding of what we have of him. And I think for the athletic testing, we know that he's a good athlete, but for the guys that he stacked up against, which are Will Levis, who is talked up to be a good athlete, Anthony Richardson, who might have the best combine performance for a quarterback ever. He's that good of an athlete. And CJ Stroud's not even going to run. So for him to go not test as well as some of those other guys, it might impact the perception on him. He's obviously going to get weighed in. He's going to get all of his measurables in. But I see Bryce Young where he's going to win is showing up to these meetings and knocking those out of the park. I would assume that he is going to have the personality and the mentality and the football IQ to win in these interviews. I think compared to anybody else, he is going to show up and be able to knock out every single one of these. That, to me, I think needs to be his focus. And I believe that his team is approaching it that way. Go in, go do the interviews really well. We'll go throw at the pro day. We don't want any other question marks brought up, and just let your words lead the discussion here on how good of a prospect he can be.
We're going to be asking a lot about the quarterbacks who throw on Saturday for the NFL Combine, Joe, and I'm going to stick with this one. This is the 11th season of the C3 Panthers podcast, and the 10th Combine we'll be looking at, and we have a draft party every year. I hate all of this. I loathe it. And I shouldn't say that in public because this is our business at this point. But everybody, Cody loves it. Cody loves the combine. He loves the draft. He loves all the prospects. After 10 years of doing this, I've just watched so many people fall in love with people. I've watched not so much breath and air and energy on what's going to happen, and only 95% of it happens. 98% of it is not even as good as you thought it was going to be in the end. I am interested with this quarterback class, though, because I think there's an interesting storyline I've watched unfold over the past years, and that is the guy who's number one, who goes into the combine or goes into his senior season, never turns out to be the guy who's drafted number one. And it really feels difficult for Bryce Young to hold on to this spot. Here's my hot take, and we'll get out of the quarterbacks after this. I think Bryce Young slips out of the first round pick. The tape is deep in the past. The tape, which is great, right? He's relying on the tape.
You mean the first pick or the first round pick?
No, just the first pick.
Okay,
the first
overall pick.
Yeah.
I think he could be the fourth quarterback drafted in some case. Every year we get a darling who surges. How hard is it for Bryce to hold on to that through all of this, where we got all the anticipation builds around these quarterbacks?
Right, and I think that's part of the reason why he's not testing. He doesn't want to be picked apart and overanalyzed. Let all the other guys that have inconsistencies with their game, let them be picked apart and overanalyzed. And I totally agree with you in the sense where there's a possibility of that happening. I think that if Will Levis and Anthony Richardson show up, test really well, and they have strong days throwing the football, that's going to really help them. If CJ Stroud, we already kind of know who he is and he's only throwing, he's not going to do any of the physical testing. If they all have really good days, absolutely Bryce Young could fall to be the fourth guy. I think that the NFL, there are still some old school thinking teams that aren't going to want to draft a guy that is built like him. He needs to bulk up. He needs to get up to 205 pounds, I think, for me to be more confident in him to not sustain a lot of injuries. His frame is concerning. I do even know that the Houston Texans aren't even really big fans of Bryce Young, and they value other guys because of how small he is, and they're worried about his very slight frame. But the only other thing that I would say about that, though, is by removing himself from the spotlight, it does help him. And he's never been that guy. He's never been the guy that the spotlight's always on him and he wants all the cameras on him. I know that he's in these commercials, and he won the Heisman. All that's big for him, and those are huge accolades, and there always is media attention on him. But he's never somebody who's speaking up and trying to get more attention. And I think that removing himself from the spotlight might help let the overcalculation occur for the other players. But it's still, again, a possibility, as you're saying, for him to slide a little bit because of those size question marks, and some of the bigger, more physical guys might be selected over him.
Yeah, and so first I want to address something. Tony is lying through his teeth when he said that we were going to ask any more QB questions. That is going to
right.
He said, we're going to move on from the QB. Let's be real about it. This is going to be heavily QB focused.
More minutes of it.
But the part of this that I want to touch base on is, and we saw it with the Joe Burrow draft where many people thought Joe didn't want to go to Cincinnati and that he would hold out or whatever, to not go there. We obviously knew that wasn't realistic, but there is a reality that when you look at the trend of quarterbacks, especially some of the best ones in the NFL that have come out of the draft, the ones that have the most immediate success tend to come in the later part of the draft because they're going to maybe a little bit more developed teams. When you're drafted number one to the Houston Texans, you're going to a full-on rebuild. So do you think even the idea of not performing at the draft or at the combine rather, and that hurting his stock is actually even something that he's playing chess as opposed to checkers to maybe slide a little bit? I know that's money out of his pocket initially, but when you're thinking about the long term and the contracts these guys are getting, Joe Burrow and Trevor Lawrence is starting to come on. So you can look at those as the exception. But when you look at the history of the number one overall draft pick at a QB position, it hasn't worked out on a very consistent basis. It's that 5 to 10 to 15 position that most of these guys have really thrived in. Do you think that kind of weighs into that decision? Is it a checkers versus chess type of mentality?
I think in general, his approach is definitely going to be like he wants to step into the best situation possible. And I totally agree with that sentiment where if I'm Bryce Young and I'm his team, his agent, I don't want to be a part of the Houston Texans, as he mentioned. I don't even know if I want to be a part of a team like the Indianapolis Colts, which in a way are have taken a massive step back. And then you look at a team like the Raiders, I'd be scared to death of the Raiders because I don't even know if they're going to be willing to pay me in a few years if they even have the money.
Could.
Exactly. Like I don't even know if they have the funds. Are they going to have to use more WNBA money to pay him is what that would take. But I mean, I would argue if I'm Bryce Young, I actually believe, and it might take trading up for this to happen. And I'm not just saying this because I'm on a Panthers podcast. I think the best situation for Bryce Young is the Carolina Panthers because he's the most ready to play. He is the most game-ready player because of how quick and reactive he is in his decision-making. But on top of that, like there's some really intriguing young pieces on this Panthers roster. There's some good receivers. The offensive line's underrated in some ways, and I think there may be a couple pieces away. And that defense is just loaded with young talent that's ready to really take that next step. But I would argue that if I'm Bryce, I want to play for the Carolina Panthers out of any of the other teams that are picking in the top 10.
I think it's not a hot take I have. I think it's just a hopeful take that some other guys are going to surge as the distant memory of the college tape kind of falters. And this is, I don't know what Bryce Young should actually do. I think in some ways he probably should do some of the throwing drills, maybe do 140 if we could see him be fast too and not small. My two questions, and then I'm passing the mic. One, does Bryce Young drink like 7 gallons? Like, have you heard of guys drinking like the 3 gallons of water before they get on the scale and throwing up? And two, does he do that? And number two, who is if my thesis is right, who's the darling that surges after the combine in the quarterback class?
Yeah, I think that Bryce definitely does need to add a little fake weight. Would definitely help him. Just a random like fun story. I just want to
192.
Yeah, like 192. I'm still if he's under 190, I'm gonna be a little concerned.
Right.
But, so I played in college and I signed with an agent very briefly. I was a long snapper. I was trying to get an opportunity. I was terrible. I was not good enough. But when I showed up to do a workout where they came and they weighed me and they put my name and my weight officially on stuff, I did that. I drank 1.5 gallons of water because I was underweight. I was a smaller long snapper. I was only like 210 and I needed to get up to 220. And I kept my phone and my keys in my pocket. So there are some tricks to try and beat this. So if I'm Bryce, I'm trying to do those tricks. Now Bryce tried to do it, is making him millions of dollars. Me didn't net anything. Right. I didn't sign with anyone. But if we're talking about the darling though, it's got to be Anthony Richardson. I think the phase of liking Will Levis, it got old really quick. And I think that everyone realized like the guy's got so many problems and he's almost 24 years old. So why am I banking on a guy who's played all these games and he's done all this if he's further along? Anthony Richardson's got only up to go. He is at the bottom level, I think, of his capabilities. Now, the problem is the ceiling and the floor are so far apart from one another, and I don't think there's really an in-between. He's either going to be a top 10 player in the NFL, he's that good, or he might never play a snap. He might be terrible. He might
never a snap.
A mess. Well, that might be a hyperbole, but he might just be one of those guys like Paxton Lynch that gets out there for a couple of plays, and then you're just like, oh my God.
Pryor.
I feel like Terrell Pryor had a little juice to him, and like
they were trying to make him a wide receiver out of the gate.
Yeah. But separate from that, though, Anthony Richardson, though, I think right now is going to be the darling, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that if he does all of the athletic testing, which is to his benefit, he could have the best quarterback combine performance ever in terms of all of the athletic testing. Not talking about throwing, but just the athletic testing. He could be the best athlete that we've seen.
Wow.
Because if we think about it, that Kyler didn't run, Lamar Jackson didn't run. We've got all these guys that don't test because they don't think it's a benefit. So I think Anthony Richardson could really get the boost from doing the testing, and he might end up being the second quarterback selected after it's all said and done.
So that kind of goes to my next question. And CK was definitely right. We're definitely asking more questions about quarterback. And you brought up Anthony. You brought up Anthony Richardson, and I wanted to stay on that. Matt Milner, ESPN draft analyst, he went on NFL Live and said that the Panthers are all in on Anthony Richardson. And listen, if you know anything about Panther fans, we have been so depraved of a quarterback for such a long time now that Panther fans are just desperate for us to draft a quarterback. But because of this year's draft, and there's so many other teams that are in the market for said quarterback, it seems as though it's going to be really expensive for Carolina this year if they did decide to move up. My question to you is, what quarterbacks are going to be available at 9? And are Bryce Young and CJ Stroud the only quarterbacks worth trading up for? Because I'm of the mindset that if you traded up to number 3 for Anthony Richardson, a guy who has a 54% completion percentage in college,
he was like Josh Allen.
He was only a 1-year. No, but even Josh Allen was more than a 1-year starter. He had a 56%, so it would technically be lower. Hey, I mean, I'm just saying it would technically be lower.
His receivers were a lot worse at Wyoming too than what Anthony Richardson had.
Right. So is it worth it for the Panthers to trade up for like a Will Levis or Anthony Richardson, or are those quarterbacks that they take with their number 9 overall pick?
I see it that the only guys I would trade up for are Bryce Young and CJ Stroud because they're the most ready to play. Young more than Stroud. I think that Young can have an early impact, and then Stroud might be a year away because he needs to develop a better ability to read defenses and make decisions. He's very indecisive when things don't open up immediately, which is problematic. And we kind of see that with Justin Fields. It just happens with these Ohio State quarterbacks because of the nature of the offense that they play in. But look, I think very specifically for the Carolina Panthers, we're not talking about any other team here. I think moving up to get Anthony Richardson is not a good move for them in the long term. I think that Anthony Richardson is somebody who needs to step into a situation where there's a bridge quarterback in place that he can sit for maybe 2 years. Like, I don't know if this is a guy who year 1 can play right away, but yeah. I can maybe compare this a little bit to Trey Lance, where physical tools are out of the world, but just really inexperienced. Doesn't have a lot.
He's less accomplished than Justin Fields. He's less polished. He's less all of those things than Justin Fields is. And when Justin Fields passed for us, and we went JC Horn, this is basically a similar type player, except for Fields was like good in college. We don't know anything about him. This is all potential.
You're talking about Anthony Richardson, right?
Right. Yeah. Like, is if you think that the bottom is Justin Fields right now, he was good in college, though. He was really good in college. Like, we are really we're putting traits from one player, these players, onto guys we just expect, and we haven't seen anything from Anthony Richardson. Honestly, very little sample set.
Yeah, because he was on a bad team this year, and a team that didn't really help him progress. But like, I think that the positives for him, I totally get it. He needs developing. It's going to take him time to get to what he's capable of doing. The arm talent's just silly for him to make some of these throws that he can make without having any platform in these really tight windows. It's there. It's all there.
This is the draft talk. This is it every year. This is the guy. He's going to be number 1 pick. He's going to be the number 1 pick.
Exactly. I can totally see it happening. I think it's realistic, but I just don't think for the Panthers that's the guy. I think they need somebody who's a little bit more ready to go in Bryce Young or CJ Stroud, because just think about what you mentioned earlier, where they've missed on so many guys, and they've been just kind of keep trying over and over again since Cam Newton. So to continue that process for another couple of years and then finding out he's not the guy and then have to hit reset again, I think that's just, it wouldn't be good for Frank Reich in this new regime.
Yeah. Go ahead, Greg.
Joe, that's actually a good little transition right there. You brought back Bryce Young, and I have a question about Bryce Young. Like, I'm no expert when it comes to analyzing college players. Like, I can see talent a lot of times, but I'm no expert at it. And when I look at Bryce Young, I see a guy who's 6 foot, 194 pounds,
5'10", bro.
Maybe. Listen, we're going to see his best year. He threw for 4,800 yards, 47 touchdowns, and 7 interceptions. Okay. We had a guy in Carolina last year that his best year in college, who's 6'1", 200 pounds, threw for 46 touchdowns, threw for 43 touchdowns, 4,600 yards, and 6 interceptions. So almost identical to Bryce Young. And he's bigger than Baker Mayfield. So what is it about Bryce Young that makes me feel like he's different than Baker Mayfield in the NFL? Because I know that the NFL is more about throwing in lanes as opposed to necessarily being over the top all the time. But you have to be that kind of player that can do that, Drew Brees or Russell Wilson. Obviously, Baker Mayfield, who's a little bit bigger than Bryce Young, couldn't do that. What about Bryce Young makes me feel like he can when he gets to the NFL?
I think the instincts for Bryce are way higher than what Baker Mayfield had coming into the league. And I haven't really seen Baker develop those instincts very much in his career early on. I do see the value in Baker Mayfield, and I do understand that, that thought of him maybe still being able to figure it out. But with Baker, he was playing in an offense that was not very comparable to the NFL. I saw what Bill O'Brien was running at Alabama and Bryce was playing in is setting him up for success in the NFL. And what excites me so much about him is the reactiveness, but also not only reactiveness means nothing if you're not making great decisions and you're not making big splash plays. He was always bailing his offense out when things weren't opening up. He always knew what to do and seemingly was making that right choice that not only moved the football, but also made a big play to keep his team in games. I watched him do it against Texas. I watched him do it almost against LSU and almost did it against Tennessee as well. He kept and pulled his team back into games so much this season. And I think that is just a rare trait that you don't always get with quarterbacks. I feel like oftentimes, because he's also a good athlete too, that doesn't get talked about enough, but I feel like oftentimes with quarterbacks, we fall in love with the Anthony Richardsons and the CJ Strouds without acknowledging can they actually accomplish this stuff on the field? Can they bring it to fruition and be a consistent playmaker? Some of them can. I know that Bryce Young can do it, and I don't want to overthink a guy like that because he's just been a gamer. He's been a playmaker all throughout his college career, I think, more than Baker Mayfield.
Okay.
Yeah. So, again, everybody wants to talk quarterbacks, but I actually do want to get your opinion on something. And it's actually about a quarterback from last year. See, we have Matt Corral on the team, and there's a lot of Matt Corral fanboys amongst the Carolina Panther faithful, I myself included. I would like to see Matt Corral at some point get a fair shot. But where would you rank Matt Corral in this year's draft class? Did you have him behind the top 4, a lot behind the top 4? Where would you stack them up? And then this will probably be my last quarterback question.
Well, I mean, the quarterback questions I think are really important for a team like the Panthers. So, but more than any team, because that's the one thing that they've been missing, I feel, for a long time, as you brought up. But man, Matt Corral, if I were to rank him up against these guys, he'd probably be 6 behind Hendon Hooker for me. I think Corral's got some traits. He's got a lot of tools he's got some tools to work with, but I'm a lot more excited about the remaining group, which is Young, Stroud, Richardson, Will Levis, and then Hendon Hooker. Where Matt Corral was selected is realistic for where he should have belonged being selected. A high upside backup at the most that maybe could turn into a starter. There's a possibility he might challenge for the position, but we don't really know what his development's been like. And I think that how bad last year's class was kind of boosted the projection on him because of just there were no options. Everyone was talking about Malik Willis. Everybody was talking about Kenny Pickett and talking them all up. But the reality of it is I don't think any of them would be in the top 5 compared to this year's grouping.
Do any of these quarterbacks fall to 9? Or is this a complete, if you want one of these guys, you got to trade up to get them?
I certainly think that there's a possibility, but I don't think it's a very large one. I think realistically, it's very slim. I think that as soon as one team trades up, there are going to be a bunch of at least 2 other teams that will try to make a move and trade up. So if there's 3 guys off the board already, that's going to be a lot of wishful thinking for the Carolina Panthers to still end up with being able to get their guy. I think more than ever, because of so many teams last year deciding to say, I'm good, I don't want to touch any of these dudes, that now more teams than ever are desperate. So it's going to drive up that asking price. It's going to drive up the desperation for teams to move up. So realistically at 9, I don't think it's very likely.
Yeah, I kind of hear that too. That's pretty much what all the rumors and all the talk has been. But Joe, so as we kind of hinted earlier, I love the draft. Tony can't stand it. So we've been doing this segment where I convinced Tony to care. And recently, we've previewed 2 prospects, Michael Mayer, the tight end from Notre Dame, who I like a lot, and Tyree Wilson, the edge player out of Texas Tech. Now finally outside of the realm of quarterbacks, what are some players specifically that you think people should have their eye on as we're going to the combine? Some players that you think might have the chance to significantly raise their stock from maybe even a day 2 prospect to a first night prospect.
Yeah, I think one who immediately pops in my head is Will McDonald from Iowa State, and he's already been a bit rising. And he was somebody who played out of position in that 3-3 stack at Iowa State, where he was basically playing as like a heavy end. He's going to be a stand-up rusher in the NFL. Long, twitchy guy, very, very underrated athlete. He showed some positive signs at the Senior Bowl, and I think he's going to test really, really well. Outside of that, though, like I think Tyree Wilson, him not participating kind of sucks, and I wanted to see what he was going to do amongst these, amongst this grouping of edge players. Lucas Van Ness from Iowa is another guy. Funny that we've got 2 guys from the state of Iowa that are big time edge prospects, but Lucas Van Ness is another big, bulky guy that I think has a lot of physical tools that has made him a riser throughout this process. I'd also pay attention to Brian Brzee, I think, who's gotten not enough positive outlook throughout this process, but the guy is just a freaky, massive athlete. He is just a very, very powerful kid that top recruit that is going to shine in these circumstances because he was so highly recruited. And then I throw out one more who I don't think is getting enough love right now, Kalijah Cansey. I know it's a lot of defensive linemen. This is a very defensive lineman heavy draft.
Please, we need defensive linemen, so please.
That's Thursday of the draft. So
yes.
Tell us who to watch on Thursday. It'll be the first day of the not of the draft, of the combine.
Yeah,
defensive line and linebackers. These are all positions interesting to the Carolina Panthers. And mind you that we're also kind of switching to a 3-4 defense. So who should we be looking at on Thursday? Not who should we, but like what should we maybe pay attention to?
Yeah, I don't think that the one guy I was bringing up, he might actually not fit the scheme, but Kalijah Cansey though from Pitt is very undersized. It's a very weird draft for having all these really undersized guys at various position groups, but he's 6 foot 280. He might be even smaller than that. He's a really freaky athlete though. He is crazy fast. He's got great feet, and I think that he's going to test well on the bench. He's just a crazy strong short guy playing defensive tackle that is a menace for opposing offensive linemen to deal with. So I'm a really big fan of Kalijah Cansey's. I want to pay attention to him, see what he does. I got one more that I want to throw out there that I didn't want to forget, actually. Jalen Hyatt, for adding a receiver from Tennessee. Yeah. Big surge throughout this season for what he did against Alabama was the starting point. The NFL loves speed. And if he tests in the 4.2s, 4.3s, I think that he could be the first receiver taken possibly off the board once we get some testing numbers to put beside his name. But he's been a riser, and we know that these deep threats are a big boost in this year's class and could be the first receiver taken.
Yeah, and by the way, I'm a big-time Clemson fan. So when you said Brian Brzee, I'm like, yes, man. He never really lived up to the hype. He was a very highly recruited 5-star prospect when we got him out of Maryland. He went through a lot last year. His little sister died. Mid-season. Very, very sad story. He dealt with a lot of injuries, but he's definitely someone that has a ton of NFL upside. Joe, would you say this is a bad draft class for offensive linemen? I know Peter Skonkowski, I can't even say his name, the Northwestern offensive tackle was probably the highest on that board. What do you make of the O-line class this year?
Yeah, I think at tackle, and I think more than ever, we're going to have guys that are drafted that are tackles that might get bumped into guard. Like Cody Mox, the first one who comes to mind, is somebody who I think is going to get bumped inside. I think at tackle, there's a fine group. We've got guys like Peter Skoronski that you mentioned, Paris Johnson Jr. from Ohio State, Jalen Duncan, Broderick Jones from Georgia, who's a very traitsy player think Darnell Wright from Tennessee is a good right tackle prospect, the best right tackle in the class. Outside of that, though, with interior offensive lineman, Osiris Torrance is a great guard, and I like Steve Avila. Massive drop-off. Those are the only two guys that I think can step in and be starting caliber players. At the very least, really good backups, but it's just all backup players for me at guard. I think at center, we've got 4 guys to pay attention to. John Michael Schmitz from Minnesota, Ricky Stromberg from Arkansas, Joe Tippmann from Wisconsin, and then Luke Whippler from Ohio State. And then similar to the guard position, massive drop-off to only guys that are really only going to be backups at the next level. So for the most part, it's top-heavy at tackle. It's top-heavy, very top-heavy at these interior spots. There's certainly guys to go get, though. I think there's certainly guys you can grab.
Nice.
Final 2 questions for you. Thank you for being so generous with your time.
Of course.
One is, what do you think about Keaton Mitchell from East Carolina University, ECU Pirates? He's so fast. He's a little guy that can play running back. I don't know if you've heard of him. Lifelong ECU Pirates fan here, live in the town. And so if you know Keaton Mitchell, speak on anything you can think about him. And then finally, what do you want to learn from this year's combine as we try? What do you want to take away? If we got you on the line next week and we could give you a magic wand, what would you want to know?
So getting to Mitchell first, I am familiar with him as a prospect. I haven't done my final report on him just because there's so many running backs in this class, but I'm a fan of him. I think that he's definitely a day 3 draftable guy that could fit very nicely as an added piece to a running back room. Great athlete, as you mentioned, and I'm curious to see what testing numbers he puts up with a lot of guys to compete with. And if he tests really well athletically, I think that's going to benefit him with kind of like this middle chunk of running backs that need some separation. I think he fits in there with the Sean Tuckers and the Mo Ibrahims of this class. But to what your point is on what I would like to learn from this year's combine is just how does this fit? And, how does this shake up and where will the separation be? And I know that we spent all this time talking about quarterbacks, but I think more than ever this year, there needs to be separation created. And I want to know for sure if there is a massive drop-off after those top 2 guys with Bryce Young and CJ Stroud, where is the separation for and how close behind are Anthony Richardson and Will Levis? Do they look a lot cleaner than they showed up on film? Are they going to answer and maybe calm some of those concerns with consistency? How do they bounce back from issues and mistakes that they have during these passing drills? If they can remove that separation, that to me, I think answers a lot of questions. And that I'm going to be really focused on that for the most part, separate from obviously just enjoying watching these edge players and these defensive linemen and some of these corners that are going to show out.
I will tell you, you can use this headline. Anybody listening can use this headline: separation, not desperation, when it comes to evaluating the the combine quarterbacks. Will these guys just continue to crowd those first 5 picks, or and that sounds like desperation if what you're suggesting, instead of seeing that separation. Joe, fantastic hanging out with you. Tell us where we can find your work.
You can find me on Twitter at Joe Deleone, and then on YouTube. Hack City is my YouTube channel, which has got all of my content on there: NFL draft, college football, you name it. And then also just Believe Network at Believe Network on Twitter and on YouTube as well.
Perfect. Thank you for hanging out with us, man. I hope you have a great night.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate you having me on.
Thanks, Joe.
Lots of men about to be running around, Greg, in underwear.
I mean, that always sounds interesting, right?
Yeah, we love that.
Actually,
Well,
no, it
hey,
doesn't.
if
You know what?
anything-
I really need to cut my grass
Oh,
and get ready for this spring.
Don't pretend that you're not stoked. Okay, you're
You
more.
want to do a
pumped
watch along on Saturday
I already told you
for
I'm
the
down.
quarterbacks?
And I
All right,
think
let's-
they go. I
let's do
think
it.
they go. I think they go at 1 too. So
On Saturday?
yeah, on Saturday.
Mm.
No,
You know
no,
what?
they will be
I
playing.
just don't care. I want to really, really bad. I just don't care.
Let's do a watch along, kind of like a Friday
Yeah.
free for all. We can't put up the stream, but we can all hang out. And it won't be like one of those where if we watch along a game and everybody's like breaking it, it's not going to be like, oh shit. Maybe on them 40 times. We can't. Is Jay Stubbs going to come in there and be like 4-2?
Yeah. Jay Stubbs, maybe.
He's got the fastest TV internet.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question, Cody? As somebody who is a avid believer that this can totally make or break your draft position, what can a quarterback show you this Saturday at 1:00? That's going to make you be like, "Holy shit, top 3."
You know what? To be honest, Greg, a lot of it is willful participation because if you're a quarterback, you've never thrown to these receivers before. And whereas, okay, if you're Bryce Young and you choose to throw on your pro day, you have a relationship with those receivers. You know when to throw the ball, on what timing, on what routes. It's basically just like, hey, man, I know I've never thrown to these guys before, but I'm a competitor. I'll go and make every throw that they want me to make. I'll go run. I'll go test. You know, I'll essentially do everything to show these NFL teams that I'm the guy for the job. And more specifically, if you are Anthony Richardson and your, NFL teams are worried that you've only started 13 games in your entire college career, you really just want to participate in everything that you can to build yourself a better NFL credit score, so to say, for lack of a better term. There isn't like something specifically that you'll be able to see at the combine where it's like, oh, they didn't do that on film, but then they did it here. It's like that just doesn't happen. No, it's more of a participation.
I think this is going to hurt Bryce Young.
I think so too.
I think I am so, and I don't know anything about any of these guys, but I don't think he's going to be the first quarterback picked. And I think this is that our guest made a ton of good points of why you could hurt yourself in this, but I almost feel like he said he's going to win in the interviews. What he just really needs to do is run the 40 for us, and he needs to weigh in and get measured. And if he did one throwing session and just looked crisp, it would just be everything you wanted to see. Now what's going to happen is you're going to have Richardson throwing 70 yards off his back foot, and people are going, oh man, like you said, and then Levis is going to be big and fucking strong and somewhat fast and throw like a 1,000,000-yard deep ball. And then we're all going to be like, oh, I guess we got to watch Alabama highlights to figure out what's going on here. Yeah, I just feel like he just needs to prove he's the most polished.
Yeah, well, I mean, the film is what's going to say that the most about him. Mm-hmm. But listen, whether this is fair or not,
never do that.
Whether this is fair or not, what it looks like is he doesn't want to be compared next to the 3 bigger, stronger quarterbacks.
And he shouldn't go at all
in this draft class next to him.
Then he shouldn't go at all. If he's not doing any of the drills or any of that shit, he should just measure at his pro day. Mm-hmm. That's what you're right. Go get your measurements. Like fucking tape measure and the scale are all the same. If we really just check them. And if all these teams are going to come interview him, he doesn't have to go to the combine to catch these teams' attention. If he should not go at all, then.
The only reason I have to push back on what you say, Cody, about how the willingness and like being able to throw to receivers he's never thrown with before.
Oh, he isn't.
I've got to push back on that because look, man, I'm 38 years old. I'm not in great shape. Okay. I'm not a great thrower of the football, but I can do it pretty decent. I was at my daughter's 16th birthday party the other day with 6 teenage boys, and we were playing 3-on-3 football, and I was the quarterback. And I was hitting 15 and 20-yard passes to guys I've never met before.
Oh, you were whipping some ass.
So I don't think that them being able to throw to an open guy with nobody rushing them really, really makes a difference about how I think I can do that. I can connect a 20-yard pass to a guy I've just met the first time before the snap.
Yeah, but
I'm just saying.
if you went there and ran a 4.41 40-yard dash, maybe
okay.
that might change things. And like Joe was saying, Kyler Murray, Lamar Jackson, for whatever reasons, they didn't run during their combine. Whereas if they had, it would have made headlines because of how fast they are. if
Will
you're Anthony
the Texans
Richardson,
will the Texans pick Bryce Young first?
Well,
Yeah, let's just get a yes or no, and then we'll move on because like we have our opinions
Yes.
will change 200 times by the draft.
I mean,
Cody,
right
does
now,
Bryce Young, is he the first
Bryce Young
round
is a
first?
Texan next year.
I would say so, and I think D'Amico Ryans is going to be the type of player that's going to like Bryce Young a lot. So yeah, I would say right now he's probably still going number 1, but it wouldn't shock me at all if they drafted CJ Stroud instead.
See, I don't. My vote is just no, that he won't be the number 1 overall pick. I almost feel like if those are odds in Vegas, I would take them right now. Let's go into some cat calls. The number's 252-228-5098. We want to get your opinion on the combine, what you will be looking for, what if the Panthers should trade up or whatever the heck you want to talk about. Remember, it's the People's Voice podcast. Cody, let's get to the calls.